Hello everyone, welcome to the first video of section 4 titled Final Engine Essentials. In this section we are going to start by implementing touch input for both Android and iOS. We will then move on to adding audio for both platforms before finally adding a simple state system. In this video we will be creating a TouchManager to handle all touches. When a touch event is picked up, we will log the event and add it to a list of events to be processed, which will then be processed when the game is updated. Go to the Solution Explorer and in engine.shared add a new folder called Touch. Right click, select Add and select Class. Call the class TouchEvent. When the file is created, make it a struct rather than a class. This struct is going to be used to hold the touch information when the display has been pressed, moved and released. First we're going to add an enum called type for the type of touch event. We're going to have a value for press, move and release. Now add a property for the type of touch for the event and add a vector 2 for the position. When the display is touched, we need to know the ID of the finger that touched the display, so add a property for the ID. Finally, add a constructor with attributes for the ID, position and type and set the values inside the body. Next we'll add an interface for the TouchListener. Everything that can be touched will implement this interface, and then the TouchManager will be used to check if it can be pressed, and it will call its onPress and onRelease methods. So open the Solution Explorer and in the Interfaces folder add a new item. Select Interface and call it iTouchListener. In here add a method for onPress with parameters for the ID and position which returns a boolean. The return value is used for whether or not the iTouchListener should consume the input. If it's true, anything that is below the iTouchListener will not receive the current press. Then add a method for the onMove with the same parameters which also returns a boolean. We then need a method for the onRelease with parameters for the ID and the position, but this one is a void. We will also need to know if the touches have been cancelled, so add a method called onCancel. We'll need to check whether or not the listener has been touched, so add another method called isTouch with a parameter for the position, which then returns a boolean. This should return true if it's been touched. Finally, we're going to add some properties. First, we're going to add a touch enabled property for whether or not the touch listener has been enabled. Next, we add an int32 for the touch order, which will be used to determine which order to check the touch listeners. Add another boolean for touch order changed for whether or not the touch order has been changed, so we can reorder the list in the TouchManager. Finally, add a boolean for listening for move for when the TouchManager is checking for whether or not the touch listener wants to listen to the touch being moved. Now we're going to add another file to the touch folder, so right click on the touch folder, select add and select class. Call this class TouchManager. We want the TouchManager to be a singleton, so add a static instance of the TouchManager. Add a property to retrieve the TouchManager similar to how we did it in the Update Manager and the renderer. And then finally add a private constructor. Now we'll add a private list of touch events that are to be processed. We'll also need a list of touch listeners that are listening to touches, so we'll add this list now. Then add a boolean for whether or not the touch listeners have been changed. Add a method called addEvent with a touch event as a parameter, which simply adds the event to the events to process list. Then add a method to add a touch listener. In this method, we will add the touch listener to the list and change the touch listener's changed boolean to true. Then add a remove touch listener method which simply removes the listener from the list. Now we're going to add an update method. First we're going to check if any touch listeners have changed, and if they have, we're going to reorder the list and reset the flags. Then we loop through all the touch events in the list. We're going to switch through the types for the events so we can perform behavior based on the type. For the press type, we loop through all enabled touch listeners, and if the listener is touched, we call onPress on it. If the event should be consumed, we break from the list of listeners. For the move case, we will loop through all listeners that are listening for the move event and call onMove. If it returns true, it consumes the event. Finally, for the release event, we call onRelease on all the touch listeners. The last thing the update will do is remove the event from the list of events to process. The last step is to add a method called cancel touches, which will call onCancel on all touch listeners and clear the list of events to process.